This is a conversation with Adam Green, a professor in the Department of Psychology at Georgetown University and the current lab director for the Lab for Relational Cognition. He has studied at Dartmouth, Cornell, Johns Hopkins, and Yale University, and it was really a pleasure speaking with him today. The timestamps for this video can be found below, so you guys can skip around to whatever topics you find most interesting, but of course, I encourage you to listen to the thing all the way through, as all the ideas build upon each other. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Professor Adam Green. Enjoy. Start recording, and let's go. 3, 2, 1. Professor Adam Green, welcome to MaxDepth. Thank you. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Max. Appreciate the invitation.
All right, so let's start off with a big question. Do you think that self-consciousness, metacognition, access consciousness, subjective experience, the experiencing of qualia, and thinking about thinking can be explained with neuroscience?
Explained. Well, it's interesting when you explain is a tough word. Boy, that's a tough standard for science. And if you think about even what we think about as sort of the most core science, which would be physics, I would say. Physics, even if we're talking about classical physics, even if we're not talking, so even sticking to Newtonian physics, before we even get into the quantum weirdness, right? People I think make the mistake of saying that we're explaining things. Where actually we're describing things, right? So it is true that we can predict where the moon is going to be in 87 days from now, right? Or in its orbit around the Earth, and where the Earth is going to be in its orbit around the sun, and all of that. And that's because of this thing called gravity, right? And gravity has to do with the mass of a body, right? But why? Like, why is it that massive bodies attract other bodies? Like, what is that? Is that an explanation? Are we actually explaining, even at that most sort of fundamental level of where science is applied to a system, and I'm just pointing to something that's quite long-standing and sort of taken as bedrock science. Even that isn't really an explanation. It's a description. Why gravity? Explain why gravity. That is not what it might. You could imagine an alternate universe where massive things don't attract other things. It didn't have to be the case, but I suppose it is. And so we as scientists, we describe it. And so I think when you get into questions of looking at the brain as it relates to various cognitive phenomena, I think that's one element of, I guess, humility that's important to bring in to those questions. We at best are describing well. I don't think we can claim to be explaining. But when
sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Do you think would explaining be describing the system that, like, the structure of the system that results in what we're describing?
Well, I think that's a good way to predict, right? It's a good way to allow for predictions, right? So I could say, I could see, you could say, well, this happened, and we use the word because, and the more that we use the word because, the more it sounds like we're explaining, and there are levels of explanation. So, I mean, I think, to be fair, there are levels at which we can explain, like, well, this happened because neurons in the ventral tegmental area were firing, right? And that's a sense of, like, okay, so he fell over because I pushed him. Well, okay, that's true, but why did you push him, right? Like that. So there are levels.
Yeah. Which level of analysis are you choosing to describe or attempt to explain?
Right. Which level of description? Right. At which level of description are you operating when you're explaining? Exactly. And so, So again, I don't mean to,
No, I think it's a worthwhile thing to talk about.
Yeah, but so to that extent, I think we are learning a lot about cognitive phenomena and cognitive processes that relate to different models of what different people want to call consciousness through the use of neuroscientific methods. And one of the things that's interesting in neuroscience is the ability to disrupt processes in the brain and look at changes in consciousness. And certainly there's evidence of various sorts related to neural intervention, including pharmacological work looking at loss of a sense of self, if that's what you're one of the consciousness constructs you brought up is sort of self and sort of a feeling of self that with pharmacological intervention seems like psilocybin, for example, seems to abate that sense. What that means and sort of the weight that we want to give to those subjective reportings of sense. I mean, I have no reason to think that they aren't real. But
it also depends on what your definition of real is. Because I mean, if we're if you're taking the materials view, I guess that that this brain is some sort of complex mechanism of dealing with. It's difficult to talk about anything related to this field, because it's like if I say the term external world, you could debate external world. But your brain is in a specific chemical balance, broadly. And then when you're ingesting these substances, it changes your own chemical balance. And it's like, you're still looking at the same thing, just in a new way. So it's not like you're high, it's that you're looking at the world with a different chemical balance in your brain.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's right. And I think where you're going with the, sort of pushing on that distinction between the external world and the internal world, I think is another important direction to consider and really to remember what we've, I guess, always known, but what's become clearer in really thinking carefully about quantum mechanics, which is that ultimately the observer is made of the same stuff, is part of the same system as whatever is being observed. And so, I think understanding that as it relates to consciousness and the largely related notion of free will becomes very important as we sort of ponder whether any physical system can have freedom, right? And what that would mean, both in terms of the I guess you could start with the classical physics notion, the Newtonian physics. That, all right, well, if we know all of the physical preconditions, right, then we could, with enough computing power, we could predict everything that's about to happen, with complete certainty.
Of final physics.
Right. And that, so there's, I would say it would be extremely hard to argue for any free will in that, in that framework, but we know that framework is wrong, right? So we know that the world is, or the universe, as much as we can know anything in 2022, maybe 1,000 years from now, there's a different framing that we know is right, but we know the world and the universe is quantum. It is not Newtonian, so we can at least leave that behind. That if I know everything that's true about the every physical precondition, that I could predict what's about to happen.
Can you give me some characterizations of the quantum world?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, we know, initially, right, that if you, from some of the early experiments, that photons and electrons are in multiple, depending on how you want to frame it, and the language gets very tricky, but multiple states concurrently. And can potentially interfere with themselves. You have the classical double slit experiment. I don't know how much you're familiar with that sort of aspect of the history of science, but the notion that if you have two slits and you in say a metal screen, and you're shooting photons through the metal screen, even if you're shooting them one at a time, and this is where it gets trippy, even if you're shooting them one at a time, there will appear to be waves that come out, which is to say that the whatever went through the screen, the slits, actually interfered. And it's very difficult to understand how something could interfere with itself, other than to frame it as the photon actually went through both slits. And the same is true with electrons, as opposed to, so obviously the funny caveat here, not funny, the world-bending caveat here is that whether that event is observable, whether so if it is observable, and an observation is a very tricky thing. This is not, I am far from an advocate for a view where there's something mystical and magical about human consciousness that changes reality. But it is accepted fact in quantum mechanics that, and again, not referring specifically to human consciousness, but simply to observability, that if that event is observable, then you actually see dots, not waves. So essentially the photon went through one slit, not both, if the event was observable. But if the event was not observable, then it actually went through both slits, right? So these are some of the things, some of the many things. That doesn't even get us into quantum entanglement. But some of the many things that we know, we know essentially that what our brains are built of, because what everything is built of, is physical stuff behaving in quantum mechanical ways. And so that's very different from the Newtonian notion that would sort of rule out any possibility of free will. You might say, well, okay, so what are we left with on the quantum side? We're left with essentially randomness, right? We're wave functions for the positions of things. That is, if we're thinking about our behavior as being guided by randomness, that doesn't feel very free either. I don't think that's the kind of free will that a lot of us really hope, or are really rooting for, But I think the third thing, and an important thing to say, a very important thing to say, is that we know it's quantum, but there is a tremendous amount that we have not yet even described, much less explained, about quantum mechanics. So to say that a thing is physical, to say to take a materialist view, which I think almost all neuroscientists, myself included, would do, to say that it's physical as a way of somehow eliminating the possibility of free will. I think the case for free will is pretty grim in the way that we want free will to look, but I don't think the case is closed, because I think that would be really overestimating what we know about physics. I think to say that because it's physical, it's explained or understood, and therefore that we could rule out something like free will, or something that is a bit more free than just pure randomness, it would be maybe somewhat hubristic, probably.
I take the view that free will almost isn't even a worthwhile argument or discussion to have, because our entire society and law structure is predicated on us having free will. So if it were the case that we didn't have free will, then you could make the argument that it was determined that I was going to murder that person, and we act like we have free will. So even if we didn't, I don't think it's of utility. And that's one question that I've kind of been grappling with recently, is the distinction or the relationship between truth and utility or practicality. Like, for a while, I was obsessed with this notion of like a personal reality, like a construct of the world, and like a true external world that we don't really have access to, limited by our cognitive capability and our senses. And I was just like obsessed with this idea that, like, kind of based on the little bit I knew about string theory, and that I knew that the math worked in 11 or 26 dimensions, basically that the world that we're interacting with isn't really what it appears to be. And it might not be still, but I've kind of moved on past that idea because it didn't get me anywhere. It wasn't of any utility to me. So even if that is the case, it's not really worth obsessing over or incorporating into your model of the world because it's not of any utility to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing for people in general to ponder, and you know, I think certainly for college aged folks who are determining kind of what's going to really motivate me, right? Like which direction am I really interested in exploring? And so I think if you, I think it honestly, it's an aesthetic question as much as it is anything else. That I think that this sort of there's an aesthetic and a beauty to pure to sort of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, to pure research as it's sometimes referred to, and that might be so if that aesthetic, right, like you could argue, you know, what good does a symphony do, right? Like, and what good does you could also argue for the many wonderful things it does, you know, because it engages and it excites and it you know, evokes, you know. I think on the question of sort of pure research or research that may or may not have applicability to in a sort of utilitarian way, I think it's a great thing, just in speaking to a college student, to hear that that sort of churning, because I think that is really important, especially for sort of a scholarly or academic just, you know, future, to determine whether what you want to do is chasing knowledge as such versus chasing knowledge as applicable. And so, you know, that said, there's a long history of pure research having, in most cases, unintended, but nonetheless, you know, real world applicability. And I think that there's a case to be made that at the intersection of quantum interpretation and actual physical reality, it may not be impossible that there will be ways of applying the observer, or what is learned about, or what is eventually understood about the observer, to reality itself. You know, that is not a place that we are yet, but I don't know that that's you know, another sort of direction where I would say it would be hubristic to rule that out at this point. So, but I think, you know, the broader question of how much these questions are applicable is, again, is a really good one, but one that we should go into with a bit of humility.
I love that. That's what a lot of the people that I've talked to have, because I mean, I'm a 19-year-old kid. Like, I'm confident and arrogant in nature. At least I can say that. I have enough humility to say that. But one thing that I've been learning from the people that I'm talking to is there's a hell of a lot we don't understand. And it's okay for you to ask these big questions, but understand that a lot of this is like new research, and that we don't know the answers to, and that a lot of what I'm saying like could be falsified in coming years. So I like it seems like science in general has like an overtone or an undertone maybe of humility, which is just,
I mean, great. I think it should. And I think I don't know that it always does, but I think it should. And the other sort of point to make there, though, is I think sometimes, you know, humans have this this long history of, you know, the gods of the gaps, right? And so essentially making too much of what it is that we don't know, right? And essentially saying, well, if we don't know this, then I'll go ahead and assume that it's actually this, right? That so I can fill in that gap in science with something supernatural, or I could fill in this gap in quantum mechanics with free will, and that's what I would caution you against, is that if I'm saying, well, there's a lot about free will, a lot about quantum mechanics that we don't understand, and that maybe does not yet allow us to ring the death knell for free will. It's not a way of saying that somehow free will is hiding in there. It's just to say that we haven't been able to prove that it isn't yet. But I think that that's an important thing to resist, is to go ahead and claim whatever we want to be true whenever we find incompleteness.
Is it romantic or naive to try to so in like the quantum mechanical view of the world, everything seems relational. Is it a jump to say, like, is the entire world relational? This goes into like the subject observer problem, which is also like, which is a problem in like a lot of different examples, like the idea of like metacognition itself. So it's like you have this model of the world, and then you're thinking, and then you're also thinking about the thinking. So it's at the same time you are the observer and the perceiver.
Yeah.
So I just wonder. I don't actually know where I'm going with this line of thought.
Well, no, I mean, I think it brings us back to consciousness in some ways, or at least I can give you my thoughts there. So
sure.
I think, consciousness is this. Consciousness is a word, is what consciousness is, and
consciousness is a word.
Yes, it is a word, and when I say that with a bit of disdain, only because we can say a lot of words, right? Like we can say unicorn. It doesn't mean that we can that somehow therefore because we could say it or imagine it, that the universe is obliged to deliver it up for us as this real thing that exists, right? And I think we invest a lot in looking for what we call this word that we came up with as consciousness, this sort of construct. But there was never any a priori, agreement with the universe that the things that we imagine should be, can be delivered up, that the constructs that we imagine are real, actually are manifest in the ways that we, at least not, perhaps not at all, and certainly not in the ways that we sort of imagine them. And so I think that's the place to start. And I think that actually applies to a lot of the ontology of human cognition. I think we have to be very careful that just because we can think of some kind of thinking or some kind of feeling, that it actually exists. But I do think, right, I think there's a good case to be made for something very much like what you're describing, that the awareness of awareness, right, that this is something that humans do. And there's a few different models for what this might look like, and actually goes back to John Locke, actually, and perhaps earlier. But the notion of our awareness or meta awareness of our experience, and of being aware, that I think is a phenomenon that has some evidence behind it, and that I think an important thing to keep in mind there is that it's not at all clear that would be unique to humans. There are a lot of artificial intelligence systems already that can achieve things like that. And so if we decide that is ultimately the core of consciousness, then I which I think is not an unreasonable case to make. But again, I think it might be unreasonable that the expectation is to tether any of these models to this word, right? Because that may just be sort of an artificial element that was never there in the first place. Mm-hmm. So it might not be, our obligation to somehow make our models, connect it, send some line that connects the dots of our model to that dot. But if that was what we wanted to call consciousness, then I think we have to very much acknowledge that's not something that only human brains can do.
how and which artificial systems can have an understanding of themselves.
Well, right. I mean, I think that depends on, well, I think the language matters here. So, I mean, I think,
yeah, and that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of systems, even, not even particularly modern AI, can sort of observe its own actions, check its own responses, and monitor its own states. And so I think that those elements, so the question is, and I think this becomes the sort of sticking point in many cases, is the phenomenology, right? Is that machine having some sort of experience, right? And is that experience of checking our own states, what we want to call consciousness? That gets really mucky because it is not an answerable question, right? So how do we define an experience? How do we define, or how do I say with any certainty that that my experience, the phenomenological experience I'm having, is qualitatively different from the experience that is, represented or happening within some AI system, some broader, social group, or there are many ways that you could define or sort of put boundaries around what the observer is, or what the sort of experiencer or conscious entity is. And that's where I think we start to get, that's where frankly, I think it starts to be a less productive conversation. And so, I think I find that as kind of like a bastion for people who find it more beautiful to leave it unexplained. And that's fine too, by the way. I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to aesthetics. So, are you more interested in pragmatics or pure research? I think that has to do with aesthetics. I think whether or not people want, and now I'm using explained, but really I should say described, whether you want science to be able to describe, the mind, is something that I think really is just, and I'll poll my my undergraduates in a class of maybe 30 or 40 people, and I'll ask them this question. And it's about half and half. About half of the people find it more beautiful to be able, for science to come up with, to sort of see what's underneath, right? To see what makes it work, and to describe that. And for that to be accessible to science. And about half of the people find it more beautiful, or more, they're rooting for it to be a mystery, that the mystery part of it to them is something they value. I obviously, probably pretty easy to guess which side of that divide I'm on. It's what I do for a living, is I try to describe the mind in terms of the brain. And to me, the notion that it could be built, that all of this fascinating stuff that we do and feel and think, that it can be built of physical stuff, that is mind-blowingly beautiful to me. And so that's the aesthetic as I experience it. It's my aesthetic. It's not to say that other people should feel the same way, but it's renewably radical to me that joy is made of physical stuff, or pain, or anything else. All of these sort of ephemeral things that are elements of mind. Whereas, right, I think other people really feel in some way feel it as a threat, and I think that's sometimes kind of a misunderstanding. But I think some of it is just sort of a native sense of aesthetic that just differs between people.
I think those questions themselves are an antidote to nihilism. Like they are such important and beautiful questions that you could think about them for a lifetime, and it doesn't really matter about anything else. That's just the fact that you could even think about them
See, now you're sounding like like someone who doesn't care about the applicability, right? About the utility.
I go back and forth.
Yeah, that's okay. That's where you should be as a freshman or as a sophomore or maybe as an 80-year-old. But yeah.
Yeah, I wonder. Do you think on this idea of building AI, do you think, okay, so sometimes people talk about consciousness as an emergent property. Then other people will say, okay, an emergent property is really just a term to describe something that you don't understand, like a gap in understanding. It's like the argument is if a system is sufficiently complex, then some sort of everything that we've been talking about, self-awareness, emerges. So I guess my question is, do you think that are we gonna keep building AI the way we are? Will the AI we're currently on the path towards developing eventually develop like self-consciousness, or will there need to be a fundamental leap? But we've kind of also already stated that that's kind of a moot point because we will never know because of the subject-observer problem.
You're going to have to reframe that. You're going to have to walk me through the kernel of the question there.
Yeah, so I was just asking, like, if we keep building more and more deep neural nets with more and more parameters, will something like consciousness ever arise? Or is there something special about consciousness? But I think we might be a little bit too deep in this conversation for that to be the question, because we've already posited that the experience of self-consciousness is subjective and hard to define and impossible for a human to know if an artificial system is.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would take that the other direction. My sense is that, at least for my likings and by my standard, I would say that what we can determine about, again, we get stuck on this word, but to me, what I think of as kind of the core box that you have to check to call something consciousness would be awareness of awareness, right? That sort of meta awareness. And in that sense, I think lots of artificial entities already do that to at least some extent. So to me, it's not a question of whether we will eventually, be there. I think that's something that could be argued for right now. And I think but I think the experience side, becomes. And the phenomenological side becomes much less satisfying to me as a scientific question. And again, maybe that's just my own aesthetic.
Okay. Do you want to move on to creativity? Because that's totally interesting to me. I read this book called Stealing Fire, and it was a whole bunch of different ways top performing teams and companies, Google Navy SEALs, are using different mechanisms, I guess, or tools to enable greater creativity, increase instances of like flow states, some being pharmacological, some being like meditation based, I guess, generally like using meditation as like a big word. And then some using like brain stimulation techniques. So could you tell me about what you're doing using brain stimulation techniques for increasing conscious states? That's so freaking cool.
I mean, creative states. Yeah.
Creative states. Sorry. Creative states.
Oh, yeah.
How cool is that, first of all?
It's amazing. Well, my sister says I'm a mad scientist. She's obviously, she's a creative person. She's a well-known poet, and she would never let me anywhere near her brain. But I think that so this may again come back to people's sort of aesthetic and comfort level. I love the idea, get really excited about the idea that if we can describe, again, not so much explain, but describe the brain well enough, not perfectly, but well enough, then we know enough to intervene and alter the function in predictable ways.
Yes.
Right? And so that's true. I mean, that's the history of pharmacology. Many of the drugs that work, we don't understand why they work, at least not, when they're first in use. We are in a somewhat similar place where we know enough about mechanism to effectively intervene in neural systems through a number of different stimulation modalities, including transcranial direct current stimulation, transcranial alternating current stimulation, which entrains certain frequencies.
Which entrains certain frequencies?
So it basically gets, so if you've ever looked at like EEG output where the brainwaves,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Brainwaves.
And so if you look at brainwaves, they operate, they show a certain frequency, right? And so you can change that frequency. You can get them to do, to sort of adhere to a frequency based on the frequency that you're pulsing in. Another method is transcranial magnetic stimulation using electromagnetism in really focused ways. There's actually several more approaches that are being developed, both in terms of optogenetics and
optogenetics.
So using light to turn on and off genes, basically so that genes are being expressed or not by essentially shining light onto chromosomes.
Holy shit.
Yeah, it's amazing. And focused ultrasound, transcranial focused ultrasound, which is a method that I think is going to be really exciting, but it's sort of just at the very beginning stages to alter neuronal function. And essentially, right, one of the things that's fascinating, Max, that I think is maybe useful to really anybody who's kind of interested in the development of neuroscience and kind of where we are in neuroscience, is that we're getting to this point now where, which I'm very excited about, where we're transitioning more and more from just observation, looking at things like, just EEG, like I was bringing up. More recently, a lot of work has been done with neuroimaging, positron emission tomography, and especially functional MRI, looking at essentially, tracking blood flow in the brain. A lot of
is that what fMRI does? Track blood flow in the brain?
Essentially.
Okay.
That's cool. Basically, it looks at where blood goes, because blood has certain magnetic properties, oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. Oxygen has magnetic properties. So you can track, obviously when blood comes from the lungs and heart, then it's got more oxygen in it, and when it's leaving, it's got less. So that is so those methods have been applied, but those are all observational methods, right? And there's been a lot of criticism in the last 15 years as fMRI has really kind of become the predominant measure. A lot of criticism of okay, so we can look at it, we can see what lights up, right?
Yep.
So what does that actually teach us, right? What do we know that we didn't already, that we couldn't have found out without your multi-million-dollar devices and your multi-million-dollar grants and all of that? And that's always been a bit unfair, because essentially that's to a certain extent saying, well, what good is it to have a map, right? It's not in and of itself, having a map isn't all that important, right? But once you start to be able to use the map, right? And this is where we are now starting to arrive, is okay, so we've done a fair bit of observing now, and we can understand, for example, in the case of creativity, work in my lab over an 8 or so year period. Actually work that started even before I had my own lab, but when I was a grad student and a postdoc, looking at changes in the brain that support increases in creative thinking. So how it is that a brain, there's been a lot of research on how different people, what are the differences between different brains of people who say are more versus less creative. And that's fascinating. It's really interesting. It doesn't do a whole lot for any individual person who might want to become more creative, right? So I think more interesting to me and to my lab has been the question of creativity as a state, right? And how a person can go from thinking less creatively to thinking more creatively. And so we've done a lot of work with fMRI to look at what changes in the brain when I ask you to think more creatively, and which changes are actually predictive of you succeeding at thinking more creatively. And using that evidence, that observational evidence, has taught us, okay, first of all, what lights up, right? Okay, sort of a just, basic science question, at least until you start to apply it, but not just where, when, and what is it connected to, and do acute changes, that is to say, changes that happen quickly, do they impact behavior? Are they related to how creative you're going to be? And also, an important point in the brain is to understand that changes aren't always, more is not always better. So we observe changes. Well, depending on the modality of the intervention, we might need to look for places where a decrease improves something, or modalities that increase activity in a brain region. We might need to look for changes in the brain where an acute increase is related to an improvement in performance. So just to take the example of some of the work that we've done in the lab, although we have a lot more that's happening now that's a bit more sophisticated, but some of the initial work looking at changes in the brain where an acute increase in activity predicted improvement in creative performance. So now we know where, and we know how it's behaving. So we know kind of the dynamics of it. And those elements of observational information allow us to identify a methodology that would be effective for intervening and know when and how to apply it, right? And so now we go from just observing, from just having the map, to applying it, to starting to use it. And so that's where we were then able to look at, okay, a region of the brain in the very far front of the brain called frontopolar cortex, where increasing activity is related to successfully improving your creative performance. So we then reasoned that if we apply a neurostimulation methodology called transcranial direct current stimulation, that would make it easier, essentially, for neurons in that region of the brain to fire, that we might be able to help people become more creative on purpose. So actually to be more successful when they're trying to be creative. And so that was the basis of the first creativity neuromodulation study that we did. And we found that they were, that both in a verb generation task and an analogical reasoning task, where the idea is to find more creative connections between different concepts, that people who were zapped were asked to think more creatively. They were more successful when they tried to think more creatively. Their creative performance was greater than if they were just asked to think creatively, but not, you didn't facilitate the firing of the neurons in that region. So I bring that up as a specific example of some of the work that we've done, but more broadly, just to point to, okay, so why does it matter what lights up? Well, it matters because now we know where to direct this stimulation and the dynamics, the temporal and spatial dynamics of the activity that we're seeing. All of this informs how we can then intervene in the system. So we're going from observation to intervention more and more now, and I think that's really exciting.
I'm glad you touched on the two specific tasks, the verb generation and the connecting diverse ideas, because I was going to ask what the metric you were using to define creativity was, and I think that answered that question pretty well.
Well, yeah, and actually a lot of those that research and a lot of the research that we've done in the lab has been focused on semantic distance as a metric of creativity, which is essentially using these big databases of millions and millions of books and articles from many online sources and movie subtitles and basically everything you can find that's written in English, and pouring them into these huge aggregations, and essentially looking at their context usage, which is kind of how they're used with each other or not frequently used with each other, as a way of mapping out a big space, a semantic space for a language, so that I know that the word baseball, is pretty far in semantic space from asparagus, right? Whereas it's a lot closer to something like glove. And so once I map out that huge space, that high dimensional space, I can now look at the distances between different words within that space. I can also look at cool things, which we're starting to do now, look at cool things like how people travel through that space when you ask them to generate ideas.
That is so cool. How are you doing that?
Yeah, it's something we're calling shape of thought. And it's really...
Holy, that is so romantic.
We're very excited about it because essentially there's a lot, it's really a new frontier. And I got to tell you, being a scientist is so fun because you get to just sort of decide that there's a frontier and then explore it. But that's what we're doing. And essentially, looking at, if I give everybody the same word to begin with, and then ask them to generate so I give you horse, you might say cow, and then you generate something based on cow. You might say, hat, and then you might say biscuit. You might, wherever it is that you're going, right, on your journey. So there's a number of paradigms where people do this. One is just simple verbal fluency, which has been around a long time. There are creativity measures like coming up with uses of objects like a brick, for example, as like a doorstep versus grinding it up and using it as fairy dust as part of your Halloween costume. These are, some of the classical creativity measures. And then something called forward flow that we use a lot, which is a lot like what I just described, where you just start with a word and you generate an associate and then an associate and then an associate and you keep going. But the notion is that the ways that people generate words and that they sort of serially generate concepts differs, and that some people will stick all within in the same semantic cluster, right? Some people are going to start exploring out of that cluster. Some people are going to end up doing a circle back to where they began. Some people are going to be going back and forth between two regions of semantic space. Some people are going to go directly to a distant point and then do sort of meandering, back and forthy things once they get there. These are all different potential shapes of thought, and one of the one of the things that's really cool about this is once you spatialize that, essentially, you can use machine learning tools that look at geometry of shapes and identify, okay, which kinds of people, what's sort of the standard way to think, what's kind of a standard shape of thought versus a non-standard or sort of a different way of thinking, a different thinker. How do different shapes of thought and different attributes of a shape relate to things like creative ability or many other abilities, whether it's in sort of the intelligence realm or the artistic realm, perhaps.
So what have you found, I'm sorry to interrupt, so what have you found about what shape do the most creative people think in?
We're just at the beginning of
just
this.
Starting.
We're all just questions, right? We're still building this. But we also want to ask questions about, do different people's shapes of thought have something to do with how they would interact with each other? Like, I think 100%. Do I tend to want to find people who think in the same way that I do in terms of how they explore, how they think through the semantic space, versus am I better off? Do I actually want to find people who have a complementary shape of thought to mine, right? Like I might be doing big leaps and they're doing small ones, and maybe that's that maybe we work better together than two people with a more similar shape of thought.
I was also thinking about the idea of like kind of like an anchoring point, and then people like kind of jumping around and then like returning. The same idea in like developmental like psychology, like when you're a kid, like if your mom is like the center of the world and you're going out to explore the world, and then you kind of reach your own set limit, and then you return back to your mom and you go, oh, okay, this is the point that I'm safe at, and then you can venture out a little bit farther and farther. So I wonder if people with that shape of thought would be more, I don't think conservative is the right word, but would act in a way like in parallel to that, like kind of have a central anchoring point and then kind of explore, and then once they reach their limit, then kind of come back and rest for a minute and rejuvenate and then go back.
it's fascinating, and what's cool is it's an entirely new individual difference, right?
That is so cool.
New variable, and so we have the sense that there's a lot that we are going to learn about it that we haven't even guessed about it yet. We want to kind of build it and see what it does, and so that's where we are. Yeah.
Do you think we could touch on religious representations?
Perhaps quickly. Yeah.
Quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry. And you cut me off because I'm gonna want to keep on going. So
okay. I should go at the hour.
Okay, yeah. Great. Do you think quickly we could?
Yeah, go for it.
What is this about? Like how are we trying to study conceptualizations of the divine, compare people like with traditional religious backgrounds or not, or just, what work are you doing? So cool.
Yeah, no, this is an ongoing project as well. So this is something where we're using a method called representational similarity analysis with neuroimaging, with fMRI. Essentially what we're doing is looking at patterns in the brain when people represent God, and patterns in the brain when people represent other kinds of entities. So especially real entities like a parent, like one of their parents, or a historical figure that they know is real, or a current celebrity that they know is real, or fictional entities like Superman, for example. And the idea is, so what is it when people say they're representing God or thinking of God? What is that, right? And one thing that this representational similarity analysis tool allows us to do is to ask that question in terms of, okay, how much does the representation of God overlap with the representation of real things, real entities, real people, versus, say, fictional entities or fictional people? And how might that differ by your level of belief? So one of the things that we've already seen, even just in the behavioral side of this study, is that it's very much the case that non-believers are have a representation of God. They just don't believe in that representation, right? But it's not that they just don't see anything when you say, God. They see something, right? And actually what we're finding is that what they see is similarly anthropomorphic. They see a person, similarly anthropomorphic to what the believers are seeing, right? So there's even some similarities there. But the question that we want to ask at the neural level is, how similar are the representations of the religious versus less religious people? Maybe it's the case that everybody's seeing basically the same thing, but just believing in that thing differently. Or maybe there are some fundamental differences, like, okay, they're all anthropomorphic, right? But maybe if I'm not as much of a believer, my neural representation of God looks a lot more like my neural representation of Superman. And if you are more of a believer, your neural representation of God looks a lot more like your neural representation of one of your parents, right? Because that's like a real person that you have like an actual relationship with. And maybe that's how a believer feels or, conceptualizes God. So that's one of the things we're working on. Yeah.
I think that's a cool place to end.
Yeah, right on. Well, thanks, Max. And it was a lot of fun talking.
I really appreciate it. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Right on. Okay.
Two things, if I can ask anything, would be one, if you could help me at all in sharing this, maybe with your network. I don't know if you use LinkedIn, or I don't really use any type of socials. I'm trying to, even though I find it cringe just to promote it because I think this is a worthwhile conversation. I think people would enjoy this conversation to hear it. So if you could assist me in sharing this in any way, I'm probably going to post. I'll email you when I'm going to post on LinkedIn and Apple Music and Spotify. So if you could do anything in sharing with your network, that would be super appreciated. And also
either I've tried to but there are people I can share it. Yes.
Okay, cool. And then I don't know if there's anyone else that you think would be interested in talking to me, or that it would be worthwhile for me to talk to, or that would be willing to talk to me, whether that's a fellow student or a student or anyone that you think of.
Yeah, I don't know if you've chatted with Bryce Huebner.
No.
Dr. Huebner. He's in philosophy. He'd be a fascinating guy to talk to, depending on your interests, in there. But check him out, Bryce Huebner. But obviously,
Bryce Huebner.
Yeah.
Do you think maybe, because sometimes the cold emailing, people are super hesitant. Is it asking too much for you to say, hey, I just talked with Max?
I mean, I think Bryce will write you back.
That's okay, great. Bryce Huebner.
Yeah. So,
okay, great.
So I think that's your best bet.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Nice meeting you. Have a good one.
See ya.